Evening, everybody. Welcome to another episode of The Breakdown. It's April 9th, 2023. I'm your host, Nate Pike. We got a lot to talk about. We ran out of space for videos. That's how busy this episode's going to be. We have so many clips that we want to play. We even had to cut out one or two that we may try to upload later on in the show. As always, we're going to start out with our little rundown of the last week in Alberta politics. And from there, we're going to go to our standard open town hall. So anybody who's on the Twitter Spaces, if you want to weigh in, would love to hear your thoughts, either anything that we get wrong, or if you just have some thoughts about the state of Alberta politics, because Lord knows there's no shortage of things happening. Got to start right out the gates, though. We finished our show last week, Sunday night. Monday morning, Danielle Smith, she was raring to go, and she went.
Rebecca, as you know, there's been a great deal of inaccurate, misleading, and likely defamatory reporting about my discussions with justice officials regarding amnesty for COVID prosecutions. I have been clear that neither I nor anyone within my staff have contacted any Crown prosecutors, as has been alleged. Indeed, Alberta's Crown Prosecution Service has confirmed this to be true. To continue saying or suggesting otherwise is malicious, as this matter is now likely to be subject of legal defamation proceedings. I will not be commenting about it further, as per the advice of counsel on the matter. I'd be happy to take your questions.
Go ahead, Alana.
Just want to clarify, so you're not going to take questions on something, but it's actually questions about something super similar. You're saying this might go before the courts, this could be legal action, but that's the exact same thing that happened on these phone calls. There was a man who was 3 weeks away from a criminal trial, and you decided to speak with him on the phone. So I wonder if you can explain why you thought that was appropriate.
As I mentioned, this is likely to be the subject of defamation proceedings. I have the ability to seek advice from my justice officials. It's actually part of their job. The advice that I received from my justice officials was that there were several court actions that were taking place, and until they were resolved before the court, no further action could be taken. I follow this advice.
So why were you on a phone call with them?
As I mentioned, the advice that I received from my justice officials was that there were matters that were before the courts, and until those were resolved, there could be no further action, and I took that advice.
But is it appropriate to be on a phone call with them?
As I mentioned, that I do seek a lot of input from a lot of people on a lot of things, and I seek advice from my justice minister. And when I asked his advice, he said that there were matters that were before the court that needed to be resolved, and there could be no further action, and I took his advice.
Did you seek advice from your justice officials prior to speaking with Artur Pawlowski, charged with criminal mischief and breach of the Criminal Infrastructure Defense Act?
I have sought my advice from my justice officials on several matters, and the advice that they have given is that there are matters that need to be resolved before the courts. Nothing more can be done until those court cases are decided, and I've taken that advice.
But did you take that advice prior to the phone call?
Alana, you've had 3 questions, and there's a whole room. Just because you don't like the answer she's giving doesn't mean she's not giving an answer.
We've had one answer. We've had one answer.
So we will go to the next. Do you have a follow-up, Marksoff?
I love that clip so much. You might have thought that it got stuck on repeat, but no, that was just Smith stuck on repeat. She does so good with the script, doesn't she? When she's got the words in front of her, she just crushes it. It's when she's making them up on her own that she gets into trouble. And we're going to get into that a little bit later. But the big thing that we wanted to sort of highlight in preparation for where we're going to go throughout the show with that clip is she's not going to comment further, because there could be defamation that is launched against the CBC. Now, to be clear, the same day she sent a letter to the CBC where she said, hey, CBC, you're saying mean things and I don't like them, and I've hired a lawyer, and if you don't stop using my own words against me in recordings of me using those words, then I will sue you. Doesn't sound at all familiar to anything. But a lot of questions came out of that as well. Who's paying for the lawsuit? Presumably, if this was defamation against the premier, the office of the premier, and the government, then the government would be footing the bill. But as it turns out, it's not the government that's paying for this lawsuit. It's actually the UCP party, which is surprising because one would have thought, given the freedom of expression element that's going on with that, that maybe the 60 to 90, depending on how you read it, $1,000 that Danielle Smith donated to the JCCF and maybe or maybe not got a tax receipt for that donation would have gotten her a little bit of legs. But nope. Nope, the UCP is gonna foot the bill. But there were some other fun moments that happened in that press conference. We put together a little highlight reel of our favorite one. We're gonna play it for you in just a sec. For those of you that aren't familiar, MLA and current minister Rajan Sawhney, MLA for Calgary Northeast, she announced a few weeks ago that she would not be running in the upcoming provincial election in the constituency of Calgary Northeast. And everybody kind of took that to mean, she's not running. That was wrong. that was very wrong because, as it turns out, with Sonia Savage stepping down and saying, you know what, so long, thanks for all the fish, that opened up the constituency of Calgary Northwest. And it didn't take very long for the announcement to come that Rajan Sawhney was going to be running in Calgary Northwest. So it wasn't so much the elected office, it wasn't so much the political life, it wasn't the demands of elected office. It was more that she just didn't want to run in Calgary Northeast, I guess. But she was pressed about this in a truly spectacular way. And don't worry, we fast forward through the wordy parts, but it's a fun little clip.
Kaiser City News.
Hi, that was 2 outlets ago. I'm with Global News. Minister Rajan Sawhney, question for you. I'm very confused about your response. You say you had numerous personal considerations which made you not seek re-election, but somehow Sonia Savage stepping down changes that, and now you're wanting to come back into the fold, but only if it's not in the riding you're currently in, which polls show you might not win. Can you please clarify?
Yes, I don't believe I said any of those words that you just articulated.
Safe, do you have a follow-up?
I do, thanks. Minister, you did absolutely say that 7 minutes ago. It's time-stamped.
Well, when I had originally announced that I would not be seeking re-election, I didn't really talk about family reasons. There were a number of considerations, and I had mentioned that they were personal in nature. And of course, much has changed since that time and today. And I had already mentioned that Minister Savage announcing that she wouldn't be seeking re-election changed everything.
Changed everything. The personal reasons, which almost makes me, like the speculation there is if Sonia Savage leaving eliminated the personal reasons, then the implication could theoretically be, I don't think it is, but the implication could theoretically be that there was some sort of major beef between Rajan Sawhney and Sonia Savage. And when Sonia Savage was like, peace, I'm out, that resolved the personal issues. That's the only logical conclusion that seems to pop to mind. Or it's entirely possible that the policy, it seems to be, of the UCP to just engage in revisionist history whenever possible, as much as possible, is now a policy for the whole party. We've seen Danielle Smith revise things, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit, how she continues to revise things over and over and over again. It looks like it's spreading, perhaps even to the constituency of Calgary Northwest. Moving on from there, before we get too far into this next bit, got to do a little bit of a disclaimer, a disclosure, a bias check, let's say, just for the interests of transparency. Because one of the things that happens in the area that I work is if you have any sort of perceived conflict of interest, then it's critically important that you put that up front so that people can take that into context with whatever it is you're going to say next. Now, I want to be very, very, very clear. I'm not saying what I'm about to say because I'm trying to add any sort of credibility or give myself any sort of added sense of importance. That's not the case at all. It's just we're going to be talking about EMS for the next couple of minutes. And with that conversation, I have to disclose that I work professionally as a paramedic. That doesn't mean I'm right. about anything. It doesn't mean that my opinion should be held above. I certainly wouldn't want anyone walking away with the impression that I'm in any way trying to leverage my professional life to give myself or the show credibility. I want to be very clear, not what I'm trying to do here. A little bit of inside baseball, but there it is. But we got to talk about this EMS situation because there's some things that happened this week. And it starts with this announcement that actually came on the same day as Danielle Smith's press conference.
So happy to share that to increase the pool of available EMS workers, Minister Copping has just approved a 3-year exemption in the ground ambulance regulation to help ease staffing requirements. The exemption allows 2 emergency medical responders to respond to and transfer patients without the need for a higher level paramedic when medically suitable, freeing other paramedics to respond to more urgent calls. An EMR can also join an advanced care and primary care paramedic to respond to urgent calls.
Now, that super chill individual was making the announcement that there have been some changes to the ground ambulance regulation. There's been a temporary ministerial order that's been put in that allows for these changes. Now, in order to discuss these things, there's some things we gotta make a little bit of sense of. So, first of all, in the province of Alberta, there are 3 tiers of EMS practitioner or paramedic. The first one is called an EMR, which was referred to in that video there. That's an emergency medical responder. From there, you have your PCPs or primary care paramedics, and then you have your advanced care paramedics. Each of those levels comes with more and more treatment options, and with that, more schooling. An EMR program typically takes about 2 weeks to complete. It's a very advanced form of first aid, and the EMRs have historically been used in industrial settings where they're on site for industrial work or standby for events. The second tier is the primary care paramedic, and there have been some recent changes to the legislation when the Health Professions Act was proclaimed that actually opens up the scope or the treatments and the medications that primary care paramedics can utilize. It hasn't fully been rolled out yet. That rollout is in the process, and we're seeing more and more primary care paramedics being able to administer more and more drugs and do more and more treatments that weren't traditionally something that they had access to. Then you have the advanced care paramedics, and advanced care paramedics represent in Alberta the highest level of practitioner that you can get on an ambulance. Why is this all so important to understand? Because the changes that were announced on Monday say, well, now you can have 2 EMRs working on an ambulance, and they can do transfers as long as it's deemed medically appropriate. Presumably that means if there's a stable patient that shouldn't require any intervention when they're being transferred from facility to facility. Now, this does not mean that 2 EMRs will be responding on emergency calls. That's a really important distinction to make, and there's been some confusion around that. Where it also starts to change a little bit, though, is that it also says an EMR can now work with an EMT and an ACP. Historically, sorry, a PCP and an ACP. Old verbiage in my head. Historically, in order for a truck to be considered an advanced life support truck, you had to have an advanced care paramedic working with a primary care paramedic. This legislation, this ministerial order, changes that. And so now you can have an EMR who's done this 2-week course working side by side with an advanced care paramedic who, by most measures, has done about 4 years of schooling in order to make an emergency truck. Do with that what you will. There's obviously going to be some different opinions about that from different people depending on who you talk to. But where does this get particularly relevant? And one could ask, what's if 2 EMRs can't work on an emergency truck, what would be the possible motivation for saying, hey, you know what? Let's make 2 EMRs be able to do transfers. Well, in order to try to make a little bit of sense of this, we have to look at some of the other changes that the UCP has recently brought in. One of the biggest changes is they've said, you know what, in order to make more paramedics accessible on the street, we are going to privatize the interfacility transfer side of things. Now, it's important to understand that when we're talking about privatizing the interfacility transfer side of things, what we're talking about is transfers that are planned and scheduled. So if a patient ends up at one hospital and they really, really, really need to be at a hospital like the Foothills, that's considered an emergency transfer, and that would still be done by the AHS folks. But all of the scheduled stuff is going to be privatized out, and the process has actually already started. There's a bunch of different companies that are bidding for this, and there's a bunch of different companies that are doing this. Now, again, we have to go back and take a look at what the different classes of ambulances are. I'm going to throw a couple here on the screen just to give you an idea of what I was talking about earlier, where you have to have at least one primary care paramedic or primary care and advanced care paramedic. For a class 1, class 2 has to be a primary care paramedic and an advanced care paramedic. Class 3, and it works its way down. When you start to get down to the historic where 2 EMRs would be, that would not be considered an ambulance that would be anything more than a non-ambulance transport van. And certainly we've heard the UCP talk about these vans. Well, they've made this change now. So now, if somebody looks at a patient who needs to be going on an interfacility transfer, there's no interventions that are required. There's no fancy monitoring that's required. That patient can be transferred by 2 EMRs. But why make this change? Well, there's 2 obvious potential reasons. The first one is an EMR course takes 2 weeks. That's really it. To get a PCP, you're looking at a 15-week program, plus a practicum. To get an ACP, you're looking at all of that, plus another 2 years of education. It adds up pretty quickly. So not only does it require people to be going through school for a longer period of time to get to those higher levels of accreditation, but it also costs a whole lot more for people to do that. But that's not the only people that it costs money to put these people on the trucks. EMRs are the cheapest form of ambulance folk. They're the least expensive staff to put on the road, especially when we're talking about private ambulance companies whose employees don't enjoy the representation of a union or an association like the Health Sciences Association of Alberta. So it's a whole different beast where there can start to be some pretty creative rules played with how much we're paying these folks. Now, where it gets really interesting is there were recently some changes made to the program requirements. And now EMR courses require practicums or practical experience. You might ask yourself, who's doing those practical experiences? Well, according to the SAIT website, and they're one of the biggest educators of EMS in certainly Calgary, successful completion of the 3 courses, which is the EMR program, and a 16-hour ride-along training component, which may or may not be a practicum, delivered by our training partner, Aaron Paramedical Services, is required to receive your official SAIT credential and transcript. So let's just be super clear there. If you want to become an EMR and you go through one of these institutions like SAIT, they require you to do a 16-hour practicum. But here's the thing. Aaron Paramedical doesn't do emergency calls. They only do transfers. So it almost looks like, some people might argue, that there has been a system that's been created where not only are we going to have these people who are doing the EMR program, but we're going to introduce them to a private company who's going to give them for free to the company 16 hours of on-the-job training in regards to how to do transfers. Now, with the number of transfers that are going to be looked at being done by private companies only increasing, that's no small thing. And when we start to look at the costs that are involved for a company that decide that they maybe want to get into this kind of thing, and they want to let's cut down the bottom line a little bit. Maybe there's a way that we can decrease our costs. One of the quickest ways to do that is through wages. And so if you have a patient that is able to be deemed as stable, putting them on a truck with 2 EMRs all of a sudden ends up saving the company a boatload of money. And with this arrangement that they appear to have with some of these post-secondary institutions, it also gives them a 16-hour job interview wherein they can assess how these new EMRs are going to fit in for their company. It's worth noting that we couldn't find any other companies that were listed on the state website as having access to these potential future employees, let's say. Moving on from there, we got to talk about the spill up north. So there has been a slow burning fire going on up north for a lot longer than people realize. That there's a Imperial Curl site that has had some overland wastewater that has leaked. So we're talking about, in effect, not an oil spill per se, but a byproduct of oil spill. Now, this has generated a lot of controversy because it went for a very, very long time, almost a year, before it was made publicly known, hey, this is a thing that's happened. And there's been a lot of spin that's put on this. Earlier in the month, early in March, Danielle Smith stood up at a press conference and she said, there's so much misinformation and disinformation. It's so hard. People don't know what to believe. There's no evidence at all of anything getting in the water. It's all contained. It's all fine. Nothing to worry about or see here, except that's entirely not the case. And there were First Nations that knew that at the time. On March 21st, it was made very, very clear by one of the First Nations that's closest to this whole dumpster fire, for lack of a better term. And they released a letter where they said, hey, you know what? We've found some stuff and we're a little bit concerned by the stuff because you're saying nothing's going on, and no wildlife's been affected, but we did some photos and there's a moose right by the spill. That's not great. That's not ideal. And then they also did some pictures where they were like, hey, there's this toxic water. It's still on the ground and it's immediately adjacent to streams and ponds that have fish in them. That's not great. And understandably as well, there was a very real and very, quite frankly, legitimate concern from a lot of First Nations people who live up there. Hey, we'd like to have a conversation about the drinking water, because the reality is drinking water for First Nations peoples in Canada, the history's not great. We kind of still haven't fixed that problem despite decades of promises. So it's kind of understandable why some folks might be a little bit squirrely when they hear that there is a major spill effectively right next door. Well, like I said, Danielle Smith has been saying for weeks now, you know what? It's all misinformation. It's disinformation. It's nothing to be concerned about. It's all fine, under control. We're monitoring. Well, news came out. Yeah, it's not so much under control. So AAR test results on April 3rd identified the presence of F2 hydrocarbons and naphthenic acids, hope I got that right, at the two sampling sites closest to the seep location. These components are potential indicators of industrial wastewater within water body 3, a fish-bearing water body on the northeastern edge of Imperial's Curl lease. It is important to note that the current data shows that the levels do not exceed the surface water quality guidelines for the protection of freshwater aquatic life, and the Canadian Council of Ministers of the Environmental Quality Guidelines, the names of these things, for F2 hydrocarbons. No guidelines exist for naphthenic acids. However, they were detected in low concentrations above the limit of detection. So we've moved from it's fine, nothing's moved, it's all contained, everything's under control, to, okay, it's leaking, but it's not leaking that bad yet. It's understandable why people would have some very real concerns about the whole situation there. Moving on from there, we have so much to talk about tonight, and we're going to move to another press conference. This was a weird little press conference. It was announced fairly short notice. And it was Rebecca Schultz who held the press conference in Calgary, side by side with a bunch of UCP MLAs and ministers. And they had some thoughts that they wanted to share.
Frightening to think about what Rachel Notley and the NDP would do in government, or, quite frankly, what they would not do if given the chance. Let me be clear, the NDP has absolutely no plan whatsoever to address crime and disorders in community across Alberta. But worse, the NDP candidate's comments suggest resentment towards law enforcement and our justice system. Today, we are calling on NDP leader Rachel Notley to have each of these candidates explain their comments and why they're so out of touch with Alberta families. Calgary Bow NDP candidate Drew Farrell called Alberta police officers domestic abusers, saying, and I quote, "I can't help wondering about domestic abuse within law enforcement families. There's some sick rage there. I bet it goes home with them and the outcome goes largely unreported." Edmonton Ellerslie NDP candidate Rod Loyola said, "Alberta police officers commit crimes with immunity," saying, and I quote, "An EPS badge gives you the right to beat up citizens and not have to face criminal charges." In a speech in the legislature, Edmonton Whitemud NDP candidate Raki Pancholi advocated to cut police budgets, saying, and I quote, "I'm all for spending less money on our criminal justice system." Edmonton Highlands Norwood NDP candidate Janice Irwin shared the disgusting defund the police hashtag on social media. And Lethbridge East NDP candidate Rob Miyashiro supported a motion to cut the police budget in his city while he was serving on council. These comments and actions, particularly the disgraceful comments, are extremely serious and come from a party that has no plan or ability to tackle crime and disorder in our communities. At a time when Albertans are looking for real solutions on crime and disorder, these candidates are harboring deep-seated resentment against our men and women in uniform, and they are seeking to sow anger and division against law enforcement in our communities. So we want Rachel Notley to show some support for our police and show these candidates the door.
Now, there's so much to unpack here. I think it's great that Rebecca Schultz has decided that she's going to start her leadership campaign early for when Danielle Smith gets shown the door. Because the reality is, unless Danielle Smith wins a crushing landslide in the next election, she's not that party is going to eat her alive. And here's Rebecca Schultz standing up in Calgary without the leader, talking about all the NDP are so bad they hate police. We're gonna unpack some of this because there is some important unpacking to be done here. First of all, we're gonna talk about the Lethbridge candidate, Rob Miyashiro, that Ms. Schultz mentioned, because as expected, there's some nuance in the story. Now, one of the things that happened with this city budget in Lethbridge was there was a great deal of conversation in regards to, hey, COVID happened, our revenue's in the crapper, how are we going to navigate this? And there were a couple of different conversations that happened. One of them did include a 10% reduction to the Lethbridge Police Service funding. But with that also came, $1 million reduction to the Lethbridge Police Service. With that also came a 10% reduction to city councilors' funding, their pay. They took a 10% pay cut. So this wasn't that city councilors were just going, we hate the cops so much. It was literally them saying, we've had a very rough couple of years because of this pandemic, and the way that the funding model has been changed by the UCP makes it harder to fund these things. So we got to make some changes. We're going to cut our wages, and we do have to cut the Lethbridge Police Service budget a little bit. The NDP candidate for the area, and anyone who follows the show know, we're not trying to woo the NDP at all. But the NDP candidate at the time that they're referring to was very clear. He was not anti-police. This was not an anti-police thing. This was, we only have so many dollars, and this happens to be one of our biggest budget line items. The next one we got to talk about is they threw some mud at Raki Pancholi. Let's listen to what she actually said, not just the one sentence.
If there's no in-person hearings, does that not disadvantage certain communities where perhaps English is not their first language, where they may have difficulties communicating themselves in writing? And so I'm all for, Mr. Speaker, spending less money on our criminal justice system and actually investing, now I believe in investing those additional dollars into our communities. That's where I believe the money we save on our criminal justice system should go. Money saved on court time and lawyers and the process, that actually should go back into our communities, not, for example, Mr. Speaker, I don't agree that should go into the pockets of big corporations. I believe it should go into our communities and should support more initiatives so that police don't have to do all the social work for us, that we can actually ask our community agencies who work directly with people to support them.
Outrageous. Outrageous. If there's going to be a decrease in the police budget, that money should instead go towards addressing the social issues that tend to be the main drivers of crime. what a inflammatory concept. How dare. It's so stupid. It's so stupid. Literally what the MLA Rocky Pacioli was talking about was the idea that, hey, you know what? If we're going to move money around rather than giving it to corporations through major tax breaks, maybe one of the things that we could do is start funding some things that address the things that cause people to turn to crime. Because as much as there is this bullshit narrative that exists out there that people are out there just stabbing for fun, that's not the reality. The vast majority of crimes that occur because somebody's life isn't going great. Now, what drove the not great? There's a whole lot of debate and discussion to be had around there. But saying, hey, maybe if we address some of these social issues that drive crime, maybe that would be a good way to go. That's not a terrible idea. And in regards to the attack on Janice Irwin for using the hashtag defund the police, defund the police is one of the worst branded little social exercises that we've seen in a long time because depending on who you talk to, it means a whole bunch of different things. We've learned that the hard way in some of the conversations that we've had with folks here. We've had conversations with people who believe that defund the police should mean we get rid of the police entirely. There's no more police. We get rid of them. That's a small group of people, though. The vast majority of people who are talking about defund the police are talking about it in the American context, where the money that gets shoveled into American police departments and the mechanisms by which they can take money from the people that they're arresting or charging with crimes are wildly disproportionate to what the actual need is. What defund the police comes from is the idea that, hey, rather than giving the cops all of the toys and making them militaries, maybe what we should do is use some of that money to address some of these social issues. And particularly when we're talking about the United States, that is a huge, big, complex conversation. It's also worth noting that a lot of the time that the defund the police hashtag was being circulated had to do with the death of George Floyd, which was absolutely a travesty of justice and one that happens in the United States all too often. Now, there's certainly people here in Canada who would say, you know what, we have similar problems when it comes to policing of Indigenous and First Nations people, and they wouldn't be wrong. And that further solidifies the argument that maybe we should be having conversations about how do we properly fund these social issues and address these social issues rather than just dump more and more money into more police. I want to be very clear. I believe in the work that the police do. I work very closely with police on a regular basis. And the work ethic that most police officers bring to the table is absolutely remarkable. It is humbling. It is inspiring. Some of the best people that I know work as police officers. I want to be really, really clear about that. So this is not an anti-cop tirade. But if we can't have a nuanced conversation about why we need police in the first place, not only are we doing a societal disservice, but we're doing a disservice to the police officers as well. And this brings us to the comment by Drew Farrell. Now, it's worth noting that Drew Farrell walked that comment back pretty quick. She apologized for the comment. She made it clear that she was responding to the situation in the United States, and she made it clear that it was not supposed to be reflective of the Calgary Police Service. Good for her. If that's the way that she wants to handle it, that's cool. But here's the problem, and this is going to be uncomfortable, so brace yourselves. We don't have a whole lot of data in regards to how often domestic violence occurs within law enforcement. Unfortunately, most of the data that we do have comes out of the United States. And there's two things that data seems to say. Thing number one is it goes wildly unreported. Thing number two, and this is based on a congressional hearing that was conducted in 1991. So we're going way, way back. There's no question about that. But what this congressional hearing heard was that the rate of domestic violence inside of law enforcement Well, first, let me give you the rate that sits outside of law enforcement. So the average rate of domestic violence in general sits at around 10%. Now, that's the reported rate. Obviously, it's going to be higher because there's a lot of it that doesn't go reported. But the reported rate is around 10%. What this congressional hearing heard was that the reported rate inside of law enforcement is actually closer to 40%, which is a huge number. Now, there's a lot of people who have sort of said back and forth, how does this cut? We don't know. We don't have a whole lot of accurate data. But here's the thing that a real leader would say. I would argue. Drew Farrell's comments were inflammatory. There's no question. There was no question that they came from an angry place. It's good that she walked them back, but it would be doing a disservice to our men and women in uniform to not be willing to at least have the conversation about the rates and the prevalence of domestic violence inside of the law enforcement community. To not have that conversation because we want to pretend that the people who are showing up and dealing with the very worst of the very worst are somehow immune to the psychological damage and wear and tear that occurs from doing that job is disingenuous, it's harmful, and it sets police officers up for failure. It also sets their families up for failure. To try to weaponize that heading into an election is some of the grossest possible politics that, quite frankly, I can imagine, especially given that so much of it is taken out of context, especially given, in regards to Drew Farrell's comments, she walked them back, she apologized for the tone in which she presented them. But for the UCP to hold this little press conference where they decided that they were going to stand up and say, hey, we're going to cherry pick a bunch of comments, not even full statements. We're going to pick and choose the best arrangement of words. And then we're going to call for Rachel Notley to get rid of all of her heavy hitters. Notably also the ones that arguably represent, with the exception of Janice Irwin, because she's a lock. But when we're talking about Drew Farrell in Calgary, she's a real threat to the UCP. When we're talking about the Lethbridge candidate, he's a real threat to the UCP. This was just gross politicking. That's all that it was. Speaking of gross politicking, Tyler Shandro made his way into the news again. Justice Minister Tyler Shandro. It still hurts to say that because his Law Society hearings still haven't been resolved. They announced and they passed their new bill where they changed the rules for firearms. So, a little bit of a preamble here. The federal government has said, hey, we've got a bunch of these guns that we want to get off the streets. They're kind of scary looking. Now, that is a whole other conversation, and it's not one that we're necessarily going to have today unless people want to weigh in on the Twitter spaces once we're done our little rundown here. But that's a whole other conversation, whether or not the merits of the guns that they chose, or apparently in some cases in the first draft, the airsoft rifles that they chose, which shoot little plastic balls, not bullets. It's kind of silly. But with those decisions being made, that's something the federal government has said. And it's something that the provincial government has made it very clear that they're not big fans of. So how are they going to get around it? Well, they introduced this new bill that in effect says any town, city, municipality, anywhere that decides that they want to get any kind of funding from the federal government in order to obtain, confiscate, collect, whatever the word that we want to use is, and it will change depending on the circumstances, let's be clear. But any of these things that need to happen, in order for the municipality to do that, they have to get a permit from Tyler Shandro, who has said he doesn't think anybody should get any permits. So they've created, in a fascinating twist, a boatload of red tape to try to stop the federal government from collecting these firearms. It's almost certainly going to be challenged in court. That much is pretty much a given. But go Tyler. At least he's not yelling at anyone yet. Moving on from there. We finally got a little bit of word on what's happening to the Tylenol, the Turkish Tylenol, the payroll I think I'm pronouncing it correctly. There was a leaked memorandum that made its way around social media that made it very, very clear that the plan for a good chunk of this Tylenol, which, to be clear, when Danielle Smith announced it, she was adamant. This is going to be used for moms and dads who can't get Tylenol for their kids right now. Well, it turns out they can get Tylenol for their kids, and we're $80 million in the hole on this little vanity project. So the memo came out that all hospitals in AHS are compelled to utilize this supply. Now, it's important to be clear. There's no indication, there's no reports that these drugs are dangerous. It's really important to be clear on that. And it's really easy to make fun of because, yeah, it is Dr. Oz's mom's company, because of course it is, that put together this single order that will never be replicated and is not being offered to anyone on the market, almost as if because Atabay recognizes that it's turned into a complete dumpster fire on their end, and it's probably doing some brand harm. But there's nothing to say that the acetaminophen that's in this mix is bad. It's just in a different dose. Now, that does present its own problems for sure, and there's been a lot of healthcare workers and physicians who have raised the concern that, well, now this is a change in dosing, and that's how you introduce the possibility of medication errors. Even if there are medication errors, when we're talking about the amount of dosing that's involved, it's still within a fairly safe line. So trying to say that the payroll medication is unsafe is a little bit disingenuous. What it is, though, is an absolute boondoggle and a total waste of taxpayers' money that is being, hospitals and Alberta Health Services apparently are being compelled, their word not mine, to use so it doesn't all go to waste because it's all sitting in the pharmacies that took it. Apparently it's not selling so great, and there's a lot of pharmacies who have said, why would I stock this stuff when people want the Tylenol? Or the Motrin, the children's Motrin. They like those names. They know those names. The packages are much nicer. They have happy pictures on them. Why would I stock this stuff? So apparently, in order to not burn up the whole $10 million that was budgeted for wastage, they're now compelling hospitals to use it. So that's fun. And that brings us to our main event, if you will. That brings us to the Saturday. Your province, your premier never fails to disappoint. You know, I was talking with somebody earlier this week. We have a really great episode coming up on Wednesday. Anybody who is on the TikTok, you might be familiar with the TikTok account Boots on the Ground. We had a wonderful conversation with Steve Boots. It's a lot of fun. It's some lighthearted fare, but we still have some pretty serious conversation in there as well. Definitely don't want to miss it. It'll be up early for our Patreon supporters. But we had a whole conversation about Jon Stewart. Turns out Steve Boots, big Jon Stewart fan as well. And we shared a couple of jokes around the whole Jon Stewart used to do this this bit about going into the turd mines to find things to make jokes about. Your province, your premier, has turned into one of the richest turd mines that exists in Alberta politics right now. And Danielle Smith did not fail to disappoint. Now, before we play the first clip, I just want to take your attention all the way back to the beginning of the show when Danielle Smith said, on the advice of my lawyers, I will not be commenting any further. There will be no further commenting. The commenting is done in regards to the Arthur Pawlowski debacle. Unless, of course, it's Saturday morning.
Pawlowski thing. Are we done with it?
Well, I don't know. I mean, my opponents keep on raising it. I mean, I understand the concern that people have. Obviously, Mr. Pawlowski holds some very extreme views that I disagree with completely. When we talked, I thought we were talking in the context of him being a political party leader, because he was at the time the head of the Independence Party. And it turned into a discussion about what I was doing with COVID amnesty. And I've been very clear about what I was trying to do with COVID amnesty. I campaigned on it. I said I would look into ways in which we might be able to address the non-violent, non-firearms related, non-contempt of court related charges. And I circled back with my justice minister, who told me the same thing that I'd heard in the brief. There had been no changes in the court cases we were waiting for, and we were waiting the outcome of them. We're still waiting the outcome of them, actually. And so there's still a couple of court cases that need to be decided, and that's where I've left it. I mean, the Attorney General has the sole authority to make the decision on how to proceed with these cases, and I respect that. So I've taken his advice, and that's where we have it.
I love so much the tone of voice that Danielle Smith uses at the opening of that question. Are we done with the Art Parlowski thing? Well, I don't know. It sounds like she's a character from The Princess Bride or something. The Miracle Max. I feel like she could do a great Miracle Max, or perhaps the Miracle Max's wife. But there's some problems with that thing, because she tries to say there, oh, I was talking to Art because he was a provincial party leader. We got to talk to provincial party leaders. I haven't seen any publicized phone recordings of Danielle Smith having conversations with the Alberta party leader or the Green party leader or the Liberal party leader or any of the other parties that are actually polling higher than the Independence Party historically has. Those conversations we haven't heard about those. So that's kind of funny. Also, given the whole tone of the conversation and the fact that it was coordinated by at the time, president of the Alberta Prosperity Project, of who we know Danielle Smith is a huge fan of. It really strains the narrative that she's trying to sell there, but it also marks yet another departure from, or evolution, I suppose might be a better word, of the story that Danielle Smith has tried to spin with Albertans in regards to why was she even talking to the guy who said to the folks at the Coots blockade, this could be our Alamo, and if it is, so be it. The guy who we threw up a video on our Twitter earlier this week where Arthur was served a ticket by 3 female Calgary police officers. And Arthur's reaction was, "You send 3 women? Like I am a dog?" Which in no way shows any sort of latent, overt misogyny in any way. That's the caliber of person that Danielle Smith was taking the phone call from. And all of those things happened. And it's also worth remembering that Danielle Smith did say that she followed Art's advocacy closely. So presumably she knew about some of these things. But that was just the start of the show. It just got so much better from there.
It in a 2-step process. I regret that the work hadn't been done on it earlier. I think the problem really just emerged in the last few years as we ended up with such a devastating downturn, or such a devastating recession. But now we're back, and as Rebecca Schultz said, it's time to pay up. So we're working on it. I have it on my list to see if we could. We're sort of run out of time. As I mentioned, I only got elected in November. We only had 2 legislative sessions. We got the first piece done, but we are highly motivated to get that second piece done, because it's just not acceptable. If you want to develop the resources in the province, you got to pay your bills.
That was in response to a question that was asked about oil companies not paying their municipal taxes and oil companies not paying the land fees that they owe to the people whose land that they're on pulling stuff out of the ground for. Danielle Smith's response, "Oh, we're highly motivated. We're working on it. We only had 2 legislative sessions, though, so what are you going to do?" I can't even get through this with a straight face. It's worth remembering that in not one, but both of those legislative sessions that Danielle Smith had, where she was highly motivated to address this issue, she cut them both short by a week. There were 2 weeks of time that was scheduled for the MLAs and the government to be doing the work of the legislature inside of the legislature. And on both legislative sittings, Danielle Smith and the UCP said, well, we could, but Christmas is in like a week and a half, guys. We want to go home. Both legislative sessions that happened on. They cut out a week early on both of them. It's incredibly disingenuous for Danielle Smith to be claiming that this is a high priority item when they're cutting class early to go do presumably something more fun. Who knows? But then we get to the real question, the one that we're seeing all of the ads for. And this is where we're going to do a little bit of a deep dive this week.
Off with a text. This one comes from Cowtown Bob. He says, I tend to agree with you that the government doesn't need to cover the full cost of a doctor visit. I'm presuming that he's referencing those NDP ads, as our government should promote self-reliance among the people. What steps are you going to promote to give Albertans a stronger sense of self-reliance? They would never get this from the NDP. And again, that's from Cowtown Bob.
Well, let me tell Cowtown Bob, I disagree with him that no one should ever pay out of pocket for a doctor's visit or for a hospital or surgical visit. It shouldn't surprise you that the NDP is making assertions that simply aren't true. So no one will ever pay for a doctor visit or a surgical visit or a hospital visit in this province. Under the Canada Health Act, that's one of the agreements that we have with the federal government, is that we will fully fund those things. We in fact have gone further. When I met with federal officials, they were really surprised that we had taken off the user fees on addiction treatment beds. Most other provinces charged, and the NDP charged $40 a day when they were in power on addiction treatment beds. We removed that charge because we know that mental health and addiction is an essential part of the healthcare system, and if we don't treat those as essential services, then it's going to end up causing people to get to a point where they may have to be hospitalized. So we want to address it at the front end. But the approach I do want to take is that I want to cover more services and make it more comprehensive. That's what a health spending account is all about. Politicians have them. It's $950 that politicians have. So taxpayers are paying for politicians to be able to get acupuncture and chiropractic and their eye exams and glasses. And I feel if you're going to be asking taxpayers to pay for that for politicians, why wouldn't we make those same kind of accounts available to everyone? That's the approach that I'm going to take. I know it's been mischaracterized, but I hope I can, I'll do whatever I can to keep on telling people exactly what it is that we're planning on doing. We want to make the system more comprehensive so people have the money to be able to pay for all of the preventative things that we know are not currently covered.
It's ridiculous. Where did the ADP get such a crazy idea? It's not like there's recordings of Smith saying words.
To find a way to get more money into the system, which doesn't necessarily mean more taxes. That's what the beauty of the health spending account is all about, is that not only would we seed it with a bit of money, but then we would give you the incentive to put more money in for your own medical needs, get your employer to put money in, raise money to put money in, get family members to donate money in, because I recognize we're going to need more dollars as we go forward. But I don't think that you want to put more tax dollars in a general pot of money to give to the head of AHS to have them make decisions about whether or not you get medical treatment. I think we need to create a mechanism for you to put more money in your own account for your own health needs and your family's health needs. And that's one way that we can avoid the excessive growth that we've seen in healthcare.
We could save a whole lot of tax dollars if we just made people pay for the things. Now, you might be tempted to make the argument, as you can see, Danielle Smith was kind of speaking off the cuff a little bit there. She was kind of improvising a little bit as she went. Maybe she didn't actually mean it. She was riffing in one of her online town halls. It's not like she actually took the time to write down these words as some kind of a policy. She would never do something like, oh, wait. She did exactly that. In a 2021 publication from the School of Public Policy out of the University of Calgary, Danielle Smith contributed a chapter called Alberta's Key Challenges and Opportunities. 2021. Let's bear that in mind. Now, what did she have to say in this treatise on the key challenges and opportunities, in particularly regarding healthcare? Here's a quote. We should begin to talk about creating a publicly administered health insurance system based on principles of proper insurance. In a proper insurance program, there's usually a deductible or a copayment on services until it reaches a certain maximum when catastrophic coverage kicks in. If we establish the principle of health spending accounts, then we can also establish copayments. It doesn't need to be onerous, and it could be on a sliding scale. So there's Danielle Smith making the argument, well, if we introduced these health spending accounts, boy, that would be able to, we could start to introduce health insurance. We could basically just Americanize the whole system. But wait, maybe that paragraph's being taken out of context. I wonder if she said anything else. Oh, she did. Once people get used to the concept of paying out of pocket for more things themselves, then we can change the conversation in healthcare. Instead of asking, what services will the government delist, we would be asking what services are paid for directly by the government and what services are paid for out of your health spending account. My view is that the entire budget for general practitioners should be paid for from health spending accounts. And let's just go back and play that clip one more time. Where does Danielle Smith think the money for health spending accounts should come from?
To find a way to get more money into the system, which doesn't necessarily mean more taxes. That's what the beauty of the health spending account is all about, is that not only would we seed it with a bit of money, but then we would give you the incentive to put more money in for your own medical needs, get your employer to put money in, raise money to put money in, get family members to donate money in, because I recognize we're going to need more dollars as we go forward. But I don't think that you want to put more tax dollars in a general pot of money to give to the head of AHS to have them make decisions about whether or not you get medical treatment. I think we need to create a mechanism for you could put more money in your own account for your own health needs and your family's health needs. And that's one way that we can avoid the excessive growth that we've seen in healthcare.
I would pay real money to play poker with Danielle Smith. I would pay real money because her tells are so clear. It's so obvious when she's just accessing certain parts of her little brain in order to make sure that she's coming up with the most creative kind of BS possible. But for Danielle Smith to say on her radio show yesterday, for Danielle Smith to say on her radio show yesterday, I don't know where people are getting this idea from that I've in any way said that it shouldn't be paid for by the government. It's not like I said it repeatedly and wrote it down, because that's exactly what she's done. Moving on from there, we got two other little topics that we're gonna touch on, and then we're gonna open it up to the Twitter Spaces. If there's anybody who wants to jump in, share some thoughts, tell me what I got wrong, tell me what I got right. I like hearing that too. Actually, it's about the same. But if you have any thoughts, please hop over onto Twitter. You can join us on the Twitter Spaces. And we'll open up the floor for a little bit if anybody wants to share. We had a really good conversation last week. Super grateful for that. And we're going to see if we can get that conversation up again. But before we do, I don't typically like to trade in the realm of gossip. But, the DMs, they've been busy this week. And apparently there are some congratulations in order. But before we talk about that, we got to talk about two key figures in a couple of organizations and movements that are very much affecting the political conversation in Alberta. The first person we got to talk about is a gentleman named David Parker. Now, we got this little bio from the Ditchley website. If you want to know what Ditchley is, you can go to their website. But the short version is, we've talked about it on the show before, in a just perfect little flavor of irony. It's like a mini WEF. It's exactly what it is. If you read their mission statements, it's exactly the same mission statements as the WEF. The difference is David Parker's a member of the board of directors for the Canadian Ditchley Foundation. But for anybody who's not familiar, here's who David Parker is. David John Parker is a homeschooled son of a pastor from central Alberta. He's worked in politics since he was 14 years old and served as an advisor to Prime Minister Stephen Harper and former ministers Shelley Glover, Ed Fast, Rona Ambrose, and Aaron O'Toole. Currently, Mr. Parker is the executive director of Take Back Alberta, an organization that was integral in removing Jason Kenney from office, helping elect Danielle Smith as one of the two Freedom candidates in the UCP leadership race, and organizing a slate for the UCP AGM. Mr. Parker is also the co-host of a podcast. You know those white guys with facial hairs doing podcasts. It's like, I think it's mandatory. If you have any kind of facial hair at all and you're a middle-aged white dude, you have to have a podcast. That's my understanding, at the very least. But that's David Parker. He's been organizing Take Back Alberta. He's been going across the province and organizing all of these little rallies, whipping up all kinds of fear about, ironically enough, among other things, the WF. He's got an incredible little band of misfit toys that have joined in his adventures, a lot of whom include some of the most prevalent anti-vaxxers, anti-health measures folks that out there. He's got Benita Peterson, who's doing all kinds of organizing for him. She's one of the wonderful people who showed up at hospitals and called nurses liars about the COVID situation. So that's great. He's got Marco van Huigenbos, who is one of the people who is currently facing a court date in regards to being one of the organizers for the Coutts blockades. So, there's that too. Lots of folks involved. That's David Parker. Moving on from there, though, we got to talk about the other key figure that we want to talk about tonight, and that is, we've talked about True North before. If you haven't seen our special little episode, our little bit that we did, it's pinned on our Twitter. You can also just view it or listen to it anywhere. It just came out at the beginning of the year. We did a whole thing on True North and how it is incredibly tied to Danielle Smith's government and conservative movements, and the notion that they are any kind of journalistic outlet is, some people might say, laughable because of the incredible bias that they bring to the table, and the corporate interests, and the fact that they're a registered charity, which journalists aren't supposed to be. So do with that what you will. But we're going to take a quick sec to talk about Rachel Emmanuel. Rachel is a seasoned political reporter who's covered government institutions from a variety of levels. A Carleton University journalism graduate, she was a multimedia reporter for 3 local Niagara newspapers. Her work has been published in the Toronto Star. Rachel was the inaugural recipient of the Political Matters internship, placing her at the Globe and Mail's Parliamentary Review. She spent 3 years covering the federal government for iPolitics. Rachel is the Alberta correspondent for True North, based in Edmonton. Now, before, as we highlight in our little True North episode, before she landed with True North, she actually did a whole bit about how she was coming out to work at the Western Standard, because the editorial control is a nightmare. Nobody wants editorial control. Why would you want to have any sort of integrity or fact checking or anything like that in the stories that you write? So she moved to the Western Standard. Do with that what you will. But she since has landed with True North, and she's taken a little bit of an activist bent herself. She's a moderator of several far-right Facebook groups here in the province of Alberta, which in no way seems to exude any kind of a bias. And she's written a couple of stories lately that seem to be riffing on some of the scandal that's been going on in the United States. Not sure if you heard, this is what Fox News got sued for. This sort of story. It's a little while back. Albertans concerned with electronic voting machines retain legal counsel. Now, first of all, we got to be clear. We don't have electronic voting machines in Alberta. What we have are electronic tabulators. Electronic tabulators count the votes, and if the numbers are really, really close, that's when a hand count can come in. This is something that is so far out in the right that even Danielle Smith has said, this is not an issue, guys. But True North has done 2 stories where they've talked about, oh my goodness, the electronic voting machines. It's we're not going to say the word Dominion, but gosh, it's sure close. They put out a story on March 28th and March 30th. Now, you might be tempted to think, well, they're a far-right outlet. I guess we can call them. I don't know. Let's go with outlet. There's no way that there would be any sort of undertone here. Did we mention that Take Back Alberta actually has a private little chat group? And we got sent a DM from their private little chat group where David Parker is sharing Rachel Emmanuel's Twitter status, where she's talking about the electronic tabulation machines. And he's encouraging, despite David Parker's extensive experience, as we talked about in politics, and his presumable knowledge that this is a nothing burger of the highest order, when even Danielle Smith is taking a pass on it, that tells you just how far out into the weeds this is. But here he is saying, please share. We're making progress on the election tabulation machines. So that's weird, right? It's weird in a way that we have David Parker saying, hey, make sure that you re-up Rachel Emmanuel's tweets about these electronic tabulation voting machines, when there's all of this fear and scandal and hyperbole going on in the States about how elections have been stolen, and Donald Trump still maintains that he should be the right proper president of the United States. That's super weird. Hey, I guess the only way that it would be weirder is those 2 recently got married. Hey, that'd be strange if we had somebody who's organizing for a particular political bent, and he has clearly at his disposal somebody who is writing for a major news outlet on the right, at least, and pushing the narrative that he's trying to push, that would be super weird. Especially if like we got a bunch of DMs saying that they recently tied the knot permanently. So congratulations, I guess, to you two. But I would think if there was any kind of professionalism that existed for either Mr. Parker or Miss Emanuel, they would make it very clear of their affiliation and the fact that Mr. Parker's pushing apparently his wife's alleged wife, because I haven't seen the certificate, I don't know, but his alleged wife's story, and he's saying that they're making progress on these things. One would think that the right, proper professional thing to do would be to say, hey, I don't know, disclosure bias. Maybe that would be the right thing to do. What do I know? I'm just a podcast host. We got one more thing to talk about, and then we're opening it up to the floor. And that last thing is we got some candidates got appointed. So, as we talked about previously on the show, we had two candidates for the UCP that stepped down. We had the very problematic hate monger, allegedly, out of Lethbridge. She's been replaced by Cheryl Seaborn, who's a longtime conservative. I think she was a UCP. She was a conservative constituency association president. Edmonton South, we saw the sudden resignation from the UCP candidate there. We don't know why, personal reasons apparently. The same candidate, by the way, who really got in trouble in the last provincial election because of his memeing on how wives only need to do two things for their husbands: respect and sex. So he's out. He's been replaced by Joseph Angeles. I apologize if I'm not getting that right. And then in Grand Prairie, Wapati, which was the constituency where Travis Taves was in, the Ron Weeb has been appointed. The other absence would have been Sonia Savage out of Calgary Northwest, but we know how that went. And that's the end of our planned content for the evening. If anybody has any thoughts they want to share, if anybody has any things that they want to say on the Twitter Spaces, this is the part of the show where I awkwardly vamp for about a minute and a half, just in case anybody wants the opportunity to raise their hand. And in the meantime and in between time, I'll do the obligatory plug for our Patreon page. As always, if you appreciate the kind of content that we're trying to produce here at The Breakdown, we'd love nothing more than if you thought about signing up to be one of our Patreon supporters at www.patreon.com/TheBreakdownAB. For a small amount a month, you can help us continue to produce the kind of content that we do. We've got stickers, so there's that too. I hear they're pretty dope. So if you want a pretty dope sticker, then you should definitely think about heading on over to the website. And it looks like we got a couple of speakers already. We got Ziad first. I'm going to get him in the room right away. I assume that there's going to be terrible news about either a payroll or masks. Ziad, what's going on tonight?
Hang on, Nate. I'm juggling a little bit between YouTube and my phone. There we go. I didn't want to give you feedback. Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you great, man. What's going on tonight?
Oh, happy Easter. Good show so far, and hopefully I don't ruin it by the additions.
I don't think you always add value.
Tons of it.
Almost $80 million worth, some people might say.
Just a small margin, just a small premium of value that I add.
What's going on today, man?
A couple of different themes. One is, as you were speaking about the different levels of training for paramedics, and about the different sorts of vehicles that carry what level of training. I added some tweets to your invitation to the Spaces. So there's a string of about 4 or 5 that I added on. You can see them in a corner of the Spaces. If you're listening on your phone, there's a little number 6 there. So those are some of the tweets that I've added to look at from the Alberta College of Paramedics that training, as well as from the Alberta government, which ambulance carries what. So I was looking them up as you were describing them, and you were bang on as always, but I thought I'd provide the references. The other thing I wanted to talk about is, great scoop with the Alberta Health Services forcing hospitals now to exclusively switch over to the parole children's acetaminophen. So that's
Isn't that lovely? At least it's not going to waste. Like, it's a train wreck. It's a tragic waste of money that seems to exist only to serve Danielle Smith's ego. And there have been no shortage of healthcare workers who have said, I'm a little squirrely about what the dosing is going to look like, but at least we're not going to be like heavily dosing all the fish by dumping it all down the drain.
It's a little bit safer in that it's 100% cutover. And from what I understand, when a physician prescribes acetaminophen or paracetamol for a child, they give the amount of medication, or at least they're supposed to. And pharmacists and nurses are trained to make sure that the prescription for the child is not so many milliliters of acetaminophen medication, but so many milligrams of acetaminophen medication. And so it's a little bit safer that it's 100% cut over and you don't have healthcare workers going back and forth between the Canadian concentration and the European concentration that Atabay has been providing. I would quibble with you that it's not just for Danielle Smith's political jollies to be able to say, oh, we got acetaminophen for children when the federal government couldn't. I think there's a big motivation there in December to enrich MH Care Medical. So to have 5 million bottles of children's acetaminophen go into MH Care in December for MH Care to sell across Canada. And so MH Care basically had no downside to it because the Alberta government was paying for all 5 million bottles and was subsidizing the wholesale price to be roughly $7. So the fact that it was $14 actually was actually just too bad for us Alberta taxpayers. I was just thinking, what if the Turkish manufacturer Atabay was actually only charging about $7 a bottle, and MH Care was charging the Alberta government $14. And so there may be some freight in between there, but the rest of it was profit from MH Care. And this looks like some of these similar sort of business cases or pricing differences we've seen before from product that MH Care sells to the Alberta Health Services or to the Alberta government.
Well, they haven't been transparent about that now, have they? Because they haven't said, they've said the $70 million is the cost of the product, and then there's the 10 million for the shipping and the inevitable disposal because it's such a dumpster fire. But they haven't said, here's what the actual breakdown is. Here's what the broker, the middleman got. They haven't done any of that, unless I missed it.
Yeah, it would. No, they haven't done that. They especially wouldn't do that. That's the most secretive part of the transaction. But it just didn't seem to make sense, because why would Alberta taxpayers subsidize a medication for other provinces? That just doesn't make sense. Like, none of this was thought through. The $70 million would be the standard landed cost of the 5 million bottles. And then there's $10 million of wastage of unplanned cost. Part of it being the stunt in January where Minister Copping stood on an empty freight plane with a couple of, 250,000 bottles of acetaminophen behind him, like he's rescued hostages that have been locked in Turkey for a year. And all it is a shipment of medication that Alberta Health Services doesn't want. The other part, I don't think it's an inventory provision. Now here, my understanding is that the Alberta government, like many governments, doesn't operate on an accrual set of books. So an accrual book is where you have provisions for future events. And my understanding is the Alberta government acts on cash books or a cash basis, and so accrual is things like depreciation and allowances against doubtful accounts or provisions for future write-down of inventory. But I believe the Alberta government, like most governments, operates on a cash basis, and expenses are on the books only when incurred, not when accrued. So we wouldn't see waste or potential future waste on the books of the Alberta government, we would see only actual waste, which to me I think is the 500,000 bottles that they brought in without any modification, without Health Canada prior approval, and that had to be discarded. And that sort of ties into my understanding of why it is, according to Jason Copping, Atabey doesn't want to do any more business with the Alberta government. So part of it is, maybe in Canada we had enough acetaminophen by December, but in the developing world they didn't. So, you have these rich Canadians, Albertans, coming in, throwing money around, buying 500,000 bottles from Turkey, not allowing children in that part of the world to get that medication, bringing it into Canada without approving it with our regulator first, and then having to dispose of it. How would you feel? You make 500,000 bottles of medication, ship it to Canada, and they throw it away, as opposed to children in your part of the world taking it. So it's part of the abusive behavior that we in the rich world sometimes do in the developing world. And this is just one of those. It's not just an embarrassment within Canada, but it's an embarrassment internationally that this is what we're doing with our money.
I don't disagree.
Yeah, it just does not make sense to me. We talked about this a little bit last time. It's one thing for a politician, for a premier, to want to make a statement. And so buying acetaminophen in order to make Ottawa look bad, that's something that Alberta premiers have done before, spent money to try and make the feds look bad. And you can sort of see that at a premier level is going to be sort of a direction to go. But then you have the ministry and Alberta Health Services and MH Care Medical, the supplier, who then have to do the implementation. And they failed completely on the execution. How hard would it be to just say, give us the right concentration? I mean, pharmacists all over Alberta are compounding to the right concentration already. And when the Alberta government made its announcement on December 6th at Shoppers Drug Mart that they were going to buy retail bottles for distribution at retail, already by then, some of the imports from, for example, Australia were coming in that were not the right concentration. And the Institute for Safe Medication Practices and the Alberta College of Pharmacists and the Alberta Pharmacists Association were already saying, watch out, this stuff is slightly different concentration. You have to make sure that you dose it differently than the Canadian concentration. So Alberta pharmacists were already compounding to the right level. This purchase was meant to prevent Alberta pharmacists from doing that, but then they don't buy the Canadian concentration. All they have to do is adjust the mix at the factory in Turkey to the right concentration. They didn't do that. And then they didn't get the right dosing device either.
Or the
Even
childproof
after
caps,
they
or the right labels.
junked 500,000 bottles. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just saying, or the childproof caps, or the right labels, or.
Yeah. Even after they adjusted to the childproof caps so that it could be distributed outside a hospital, they still didn't fix the concentration nor the dosing device. It's just ridiculous how wasteful this was. So, now we have a contract for 5 million bottles, an approval only for 1.5 million. We have Alberta Health Services that should be getting their acetaminophen for about $5 or $6 a bottle. Instead, we're using $14 a bottle of acetaminophen. So costs at AHS go up because they're being forced to use other medication. And this wasn't bought through a competitive tender. So if you're a supplier to AHS, all in the summer and fall and winter of 2020-22, you've been supplying AHS even though there's a shortage. And you've still maintained a good price. And now you find your product has been usurped. And the $14 a bottle stuff has been put in. And what's worse, AHS is now shipping in competition to you, is now supplying pharmacies in competition to you. So not only did they screw you over on your shipments to AHS, on your sales that you made after a competitive process, they do this backdoor thing where they buy stuff for more than twice the price without a competitive tender. They kick you out of the AHS supply, and then they further ship it to retail pharmacies in competition with you, subsidizing it with a dispensing fee.
Well, I just like the thing that blows my mind about the whole thing is that Copping really tipped the negotiating hand when it came to the what are we going to do when this runs out? Because like I think it's good for like 3 years or something like that. Correct me if I'm wrong.
It is.
But there is going to come a point somewhere down the road where we're going to need more, and Copping has already said we can't get it from these guys. This is a one-time thing from them. So that's a fascinating negotiating tactic to me.
Yeah. And we also have AHS now that there's 100% cutover. What's it going to do with the acetaminophen it has in house? AHS has enough stock for this winter. So what are they going to do with that stuff? Is going to sit there on the shelves and rot? That will be a future inventory write-off. Or it'll be, we have to return this to you suppliers because we can't use it. Why not? Well, because we bought stuff without a tender at twice the price when using that instead.
You know what I would love, which would just be perfectly on brand for this government, if we shipped out all of the brand Tylenol to, I don't know, like Turkey or something. That would be perfect. That would be, I mean, it would just be an absolute train wreck, but it would be, with this whole story, the way that it's evolved, it would be absolutely perfect. We had all of this perfectly good Tylenol or acetaminophen, same thing. And because we bought the Dr. Oz's mom stuff at a premium for more money, we now have all of this other stuff. So we're going to give it to like Turkey.
Sorry about all your suffering children when we bought medicine and threw it out. So here's the medicine from our own hospitals, which we've decided not to use, even though it's just as good or better.
I wonder who would pay the shipping on that. Anything else you want to share tonight, Zad?
Yeah, two quick things. One is this evening, and I've been having a good chat with Amanda Hu and Dr. Satoshi Akima on the lobe RCT and on the Make Right N95s that were used in Israel within that lobe RCT. It's a bit of background. The lobe RCT is a randomized control trial, which is the wrong method for comparing flat masks to respirators. But at the end of November, Mark Loeb, a researcher, doctor from McMaster University, with a team of doctors, which included John Connolly from Alberta, published a paper on their randomized control trial comparing flat masks to N95 respirators in healthcare workers in 4 different countries: Canada, Israel, Pakistan, and Egypt. And they found, based on a standard of twice as good, that the N95s were not twice as good at reducing infection as the flat masks. But there are so many flaws with the trial, including this twice as good arbitrary standard. In fact, in Canada, it was around 4 times as good. So they mixed in other countries, especially Egypt, in order to try and bring down that ratio. It's very much like, it's basically they diluted the trial in order to make the null hypothesis or the it didn't work come through. So there have been different people, including yours truly, that have been pointing out various flaws with these 2 interventions. Me on the flat masks, particularly the Vanch masks, and Amanda and Satoshi on the Make Right N95s, which were used in Israel. And pointing out, for example, tonight, Amanda and Satoshi pointed out that the filtration of the N95s used in Israel was substandard. The N95s are recalled. And then me, doing my digging, found it that the N95s from Make Right had been recalled at least 3 times across dozens of batches. And the filtration performance of those N95s ranged from 75% to 99%. So very inconsistent batches. And batches recalled because they didn't have quality documentation to back up their shipping. So there are more and more pieces of this lobe RCT that is falsely saying N95s are not an advantage over masks, which are showing problems with both of the interventions, N95 and mask, that these doctors did. And the underlying reason for doing that is to deprive healthcare workers of N95s. And so, the two things I wanted to let you know about is one, this discussion between Amanda and Satoshi that's been really burning on Twitter in the last hour with people finding more evidence. And the other is Dr. Loeb himself on Tuesday morning is at Foothills Hospital in what's called the ground rounds. And so he's giving training to doctors as if a doctor would when he's giving rounds on a hospital ward. So he's giving training between 8 and 9 a.m. On in a live thing at a Foothills Hospital conference room, as well as on Zoom, talking about this lobe RCT. And so far, I've asked, and a number of other people have asked to participate in the Zoom conference, and we haven't been let in. So it might be more of this misinformation going to doctors and medical executives to make bad decisions for their healthcare workers.
Well, that's not great.
Okay. No, it's not.
You always have such good news, Ziad. All right, I'm going to bring Lynn in. Ziad, thank you so much for ruining my evening. I appreciate that as always.
You're welcome. It's a service I provide.
You know, and you have a very specific set of skills, and you utilize them incredibly well. Lynn, how are you doing tonight?
Well, I really hate coming after Ziad.
Right? So do I.
He's so friggin' smart.
I hate talking after him too, because it's just like, oh man, I'm going to make a joke about a turd mine now, I guess.
So I'm going to talk about something totally different.
Perfect. What you got?
Well, I knew that you wouldn't have time for the Brian Jean condo thing. So I'll just put out there that I've made a call on Wednesday to his constituency office. I talked to them. I talked to his MLA office. And of course, I've heard nothing back. But anyway, to healthcare. So anybody who's listened to this before knows that my husband has stage 4 glioblastoma. He's survived for 7 years, which is highly unusual. When it comes to healthcare, I have my grandfather's story where there was no healthcare, and my uncle spent a half of his life paying for that. Thanks to Tommy Douglas, we now have healthcare. And so this might scare people, but my husband has had 33 MRIs. But if you put it in the context of our 40, 50, whatever family members that are in our immediate, his and my families, that's very small. Because if you spread it out, there's only that I know of, 2 other people who have had MRIs. So the point I'm trying to make is that his massive MRIs have been paid for by 40 or 50 people. Do you understand what I'm saying?
I do, yeah.
So those MRIs, the doctor's visits, the cross, all of that stuff have somehow enabled him to keep living, and he's, you know, he's a good volunteer in the community, let's put it that way. And if under Danny's mandate, he would be dead because we couldn't afford them.
Yeah.
If we follow all of the people that he follows in the US with the same thing that he has, he doesn't have any friends left, Nate. In his community within the glioblastoma site, out of his trial at the cross, there was 100 and I can't remember the number, but it was like 177, 180. There's 2 of them left. Out of his glio site on his Facebook page, he doesn't have any friends left in the US. They're all dead because they couldn't afford to do what has been done to him. And he's walking, he's talking, he's a valuable community member here. So we need to look at this as do I care what my neighbor is going through or do I not? Because if I'm a Canadian, I care what my neighbors are going through and I'm willing to pay through my taxes, whatever, to cover their health care? Or do I look at from a US point of view where why should I have to pay for the poor or the people that I don't care for?
Yeah. Well, it gets real dangerous real quick, right? Because as soon as you go down the road of, as Ms. Smith has proposed in the past, to crowdfund or to get your friends and family to pay for the things and the stuff, as soon as you go down that road, now it turns into a question of if only the people who are likable get healthcare. Only the people who have large social circles get healthcare. Only the people who have large social circles that have money get healthcare. And there has to be, I mean, we've had this conversation before on the show where we've talked about even some of the organ donation questions that have come up over the last couple of years. There has to be a dispassionate approach to how do people get care? It can't be based on, well, Timmy came to my ball game, so I think he's cool. I'll throw him $10. It can't be like that. That goes against all of the principles that we've built our healthcare system on for the last several decades. And to try to turn it into like to literally say that it should be something that friends and family pay for. Like, if you don't have friends and family, I guess you're just screwed. I
Yeah.
guess that's it. And I guess, and this is the part that I find the most unsettling, I guess we're just okay with that.
But we're not, because we're
No,
Canadian.
exactly. This is what I'm saying. Thank you.
Please, people, remember, it was Tommy Douglas who saved us from the US politics. Without Tommy Douglas, we wouldn't have the healthcare system that we have.
Well, I would just take it a step farther. I mean, all props to Tommy Douglas for the healthcare changes that he made. But once we have a good thing, and once we know that it's a good thing, and it helps people, and it's empirically better than other systems that exist in the world, cough south of the border, cough, it's incumbent on us to protect that.
Yes, exactly. And that brings us to the point of what you were talking about. Oh, I wrote it down. Just a minute. Like when we're talking about Indigenous people, we're also talking about people who can't crowdfund.
Yes.
And so the example I'm going to give you is this. I used to be part of what was called I don't remember what it was called, but it was a youth thing. So if a youth in Fort McMurray got charged with something, they were put towards the judge and he would give it to us. And as a group, and we were 8 white people, we would then meet with the youth, their parents, whatever, and see how that went. But then we started having these Indigenous kids in, and their grandparents would show up. And we're like, well, legally, the parent has to sign off on this. But in the Indigenous society, in some of them, it's not the parent who takes care of the child. So luckily for me, my husband had brought in this guy, and I don't remember his name. He's famous. But anyway, he would come in from the States and he would give talks to Syncrude. And he agreed to meet with this youth justice committee. So we met with him and he explained tribe by tribe what the norms were, so that we could learn how we would deal with each of the children based on what their tribe was. So the tribes that we were dealing with at the time were Dene. And in that case, it was the grandparents. But in the legal system, we couldn't use the grandparents. So it was a whole, we just need to change the way we deal with. So when you're talking about the laws and all of the police stuff, the money needs to go into how to deal with the actual issue. I'm not making any sense right now.
No,
But
I'm
I
picking up.
hope you're getting what I'm saying.
I'm picking up
And
exactly
then,
what you're laying down.
and then we dealt with a guy in Edmonton who that was his job. And he taught us how the circles work and how to deal with that. And you know what? It was amazing because we were able to deal with the grandparents, and these kids were good kids, but we didn't know how to deal with them. So once we learned that, everything worked out well. We just need to put the money, like the NDP are saying, into actual places that work for whatever the societal laws are, and not just give more money to the police.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
and I know I'm not making any sense tonight. I'm just really angry.
I think you are making sense because you are underscoring the point that, and in fairness, the NDP are certainly the ones that the UCP highlighted, but there are other political parties that are making the same argument.
Yes.
That, rather than continuing to just slap Band-Aids on the thing that's bleeding, maybe we should, I don't know, address the cause of the bleeding.
Yes.
Or perhaps an even more apt metaphor is rather than just mopping up the blood, we should deal with the thing that's bleeding. And that seems to be like, you braised a whole other thought process for me on this here, because for anybody to be talking about, and it's great that she's walking it back, but she doesn't have the greatest history with consistency or, I don't know, honesty. But to be introducing more barriers when there's already so much evidence about barriers to entry for the healthcare system. And I've seen this firsthand in my professional life.
Yes.
Where First Nations and Indigenous people do have more barriers to entry to the healthcare system. They just do. They're just treated differently. And it's wrong and it's abhorrent and it shouldn't happen, but that's a reality. So I don't know why anyone would entertain the conversation of we should crowdfund healthcare when we can't even level the playing field as it stands right now.
I think that COVID for me brought out, I took the Indigenous studies at the U of A, and I grew up in Alberta. I only knew 8 Indigenous people where I grew up. I loved them, but I had no idea of the history. And I always wondered why their mother brought them to my small town, mid-Alberta, middle of nowhere place. But through that course, I realized that she escaped from the reserve to save her kids from the 60 scoop. And I had to give her a lot of credit. But I didn't know any of that until I was 63 years old. And if we would understand what we did to the Indigenous people, I think more of us would have a kinder understanding of how we have to deal with people in the way that they grew up. Just like we're expected to be treated the way we grew up, why aren't we treating the Indigenous people the way they were raised by their grandparents?
Well, and I think it's important to highlight as well. I was literally having this conversation with my wife a couple of nights ago. I'm working on this really clumsy metaphor that I'm trying to refine, but it's not that we did it. In a lot of cases, our society is still doing it. And it's
Yes.
really easy for people. And I hear this all the time from people. Oh, can we just stop talking about residential schools or whatever? And no, we can't, because just because you're not actively dumping gasoline on a fire doesn't mean that you're doing anything to put it out.
I live across the street, Nate, from the product of a residential school victim. So both her parents were in the schools. She is an active member of the community. She has worked for Suncor for 30 years. She's a wonderful person, but she has issues. And we need to listen to these people and understand that the issues that they have are because of what we did to their ancestors. And we need to be able to understand that so that we can, I don't know what the word is.
Well, it's the whole idea behind truth and reconciliation. I think
Yes.
that
Okay.
it's that
There you go.
reconciliation piece where and boy, First Nations communities have been real clear. You can't have reconciliation without the truth first. Um,
Yeah.
so I think you're absolutely
Thank
right.
you for filling that in for me.
Ah,
I don't feel like I'm making sense tonight, but I'm just really trying to get through that. We just need to understand and be better than the US. Let us just care about the people who can't afford health care if we turn this around. The Indigenous people who need our voices, we need to speak out for them.
yeah. I mean, here's my thing with what you just said there. I don't think that we should aspire to be a lower level than what we are, and I do think that in almost every way, Canada's a better country than the United States. I just believe that. It's not a contest, but we have better healthcare. We have better pretty much everything. And I don't know why we have so many people who are like, "Oh, but I want to be like the United States." Why? Why? Why would you want to do that? Like, okay, I get it. They got one more color on their flag, but that's not that big of a deal. Um, I don't want to aspire to be like them.
I 100% agree. Thank you, Nate. Merry Christmas. Happy Easter to everyone.
Happy Easter as well to you. Thank you so much. We got Tammy in the queue. Tammy, what's going on tonight? Thank you so much for sticking around as long as you have here. I think that you've stuck around. I could be wrong.
Oh, there we go.
There we
Mic is
go.
back on.
How's it going,
There
Tammy?
we go. That works.
What's going on?
So we're gonna go back to the healthcare thing and Danny's copay idea. So I'm disabled. I've spoken on your show before.
Oh, I know who you are.
Yeah, I make a lot of noise. And I've had 2 strokes and cancer. So I have to see my doctor every 3 to 4 months. Every 3 to 4 months. Okay. And that is just the baseline. That doesn't include anytime I get sick or I have a knee that dislocates or, all the other reasons you end up going to see the doctor. So I used to be on AISH and CPPD. So you get the fancy little card that covers everything. But I don't get that anymore. I now work for a company, and yeah, I've got pretty decent health care from them, but going to a doctor is not something they cover because in Canada, we don't have to pay to go see a doctor. So if I look at a copay situation where I'm going to end up paying out of pocket, that nice income that I made that took me off of AISH and CPPD, I may as well go back to being on AISH and CPPD because then at least everything will be covered again. Because as soon as it starts coming out of my pocket, all of a sudden that extra money goes bye-bye.
Yeah.
It just disappears. And then her wanting her, let's get rid of CPP and let's make it APP. Well, number one, AMCO has crappy returns.
They haven't been crushing it lately.
So beyond that, how does that happen for me? Right? As someone who's disabled, if I have another stroke, if, heavens forfend, that something else happens to me that leaves me worse days disabled where I can no longer work at all, is APP going to do what CPPD does? I can guarantee it's not.
Yeah.
Especially if the UCP are in charge. I'll be screwed.
You won't be the only one.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly it. And all the people that are on AISH now will be further screwed. Everybody will be screwed. And this is what drives me nuts about the we love the UCP folk, the people you see on the Twitter spaces that are so, all they care about is themselves. To go back to Lynn's comments, we have this culture in Alberta, and I don't think it's everyone, but there's a lot of them. And my daughter, who lives rural, she doesn't believe the same things a lot of rural folk do, but because she's my kid, so she was partially raised by me. But she's like, part of it is those rural folk, they don't see that they get anything out of like the healthcare system. Because for them, when they're off in, Tuktoyaktuk or wherever, sorry if that's a little racist, I don't know, but, off in wherever in Alberta, they have to drive 2 hours to get to a hospital anyway. Right? And if they're waiting for an ambulance to come for them, well, add that to their trip. So they don't see any upside for them. They literally have a feeling about us city folk that, well, it only helps you people, so we don't care. And I'm not saying that's all of them, but that is like, she used to actually teach in those rural areas, and she is still rural. And that's how they feel, because they don't see any advantage to it. And part of that, again, is the UCP. They've shut down their hospitals.
Yep. Well, we see the threads coming out. I mean, it's gone down to weekly now, but we were seeing the threads coming out. We just called them the very bad thread because of the amount of rural hospitals that were being closed. But there's the reality is that there are a lot of people in rural Alberta who have a very difficult time accessing healthcare.
Exactly.
And it's hard to do a value proposition when you can't say, but this is why it's good.
Yeah. And the problem is, and this is, I've said this before, is hopefully the NDP gets in. But if the NDP gets in, they can't, and people are like, but that's not fair to city folk. I'm like, it doesn't matter. If you want to change the attitude of the people out in the rurals, the NDP has to do something for them. They have to show how they make their life better, not just the city folk, because that's the only way that they're going to see the NDP as something good, is if they stop closing down the schools out in the rural areas. If they make sure those rural schools have all the skills and all the things, all the computer stuff. And I know it's not popular to say that, because it's like, well, the city schools don't get all this. Doesn't matter. If you want the rural people to start seeing a value in the NDP, they've got to start doing things for them.
I totally agree. Anything else you want to add to that, Tammy?
No, that was it.
Awesome.
You have a great night.
Thank you so much. We got another person who's in the queue here. I'm going to add in right now. I feel like Packet Princess probably isn't your real name, but I could be wrong. I think you have to unmute your mic though. Okay, maybe. Oh,
Sorry about that.
there we
Sorry.
go.
I'm here. I'm here. I'm listening, and I'm really grateful to be here in this space right now. Like, this is, it's important topic, and I kind of selfishly want to not introduce but normalize the idea of, what if we had more Indigenous representatives in seat? And I know that sounds like a crazy concept, but as someone who grew up in the Arctic, so my life before I came into Alberta when I was 20 years old, for the 20 years I lived in the Arctic, was very different, very, very, very different than what I experienced for 20 years in Alberta. And I want to kind of juxtapose that in the sense that I had the opportunity to live amongst the Indigenous people and learn from them. And I am sitting here, at 44 years old. I left Alberta a year ago. I moved my family out of Alberta because...
You don't happen to be a physician, do you? Because I know we had a problem.
No. I'm a cybersecurity engineer.
Okay.
I'm a nerd, like a very, very much a hardcore nerd, but someone who grew up with Indigenous as, it was my backbone. I was a whitey. I was definitely not, the majority where I grew up. But what I learned was that I learned so many hardcore, fundamental, life grounding principles from the Indigenous that it's really hard to kind of translate. And I sit here and I'm like, why aren't they in government? Like, why are we sitting here, like, when we have the most treasured resource and they understand the land, and we are bickering about, like, I just, yeah.
No, I hear what you say, and I don't disagree with any of it, quite frankly. I think that we would do very well to have. I mean, one of the tricky things to navigate, and I'm glad I'm not the one who has to do it, is, it. I think that there's a balance to be struck between putting people in positions of like an election, for example. So I think that I would love to see more Indigenous and First Nations people in the legislature, no questions asked. But I think what's more important is making sure that whoever it is that's in the legislature is willing to listen to people, because there's always going to be, we have 87 seats in the legislature. There's simply too many people who have specific interests and specific things that need to be represented. I don't think that we're ever going to have enough seats in the legislature to have every group actually physically represented by somebody from their, I don't know, stakeholder group. That sounds cold, but I'm going to go with it, in the legislature. But I think it's far more important. Like, here's what I would say, and I'm probably going to get some comments on this. I look at somebody like Janice Irwin, and I don't think that there's anybody who doesn't feel heard by her, even if you're in a different political bent than she is. And again, absolutely not like go NDP, but Janice Irwin's awesome. Just deal with it.
Yes.
And that to me is the core of what I think that I want to see. But some of the best life lessons that I've received have been so absolutely, but kindly, is how I'll say it, taught to me by First Nations folks, and I'm so grateful for that.
Yeah, and to be honest, like, if you kind of look into their history and you can empathize even remotely to their journey, like if we actually want to sustain this planet, we have to rely on their knowledge. Like they have the knowledge, and for some reason it feels like, you know, we're not stuck, but like there's a genuine interest here for us to listen to our Indigenous kind of partners here and learn how to navigate the trails, because I guarantee you they know.
Oh yeah. Well,
And
they
they're
have a totally
looking right
different.
now at us like idiots. Like, why are we doing this? Why are we doing this?
It's a totally different. I mean, we want to own stuff. We like money, and historically, and I got to be very, very clear. There's no monoliths here, but historically, the cultures in First Nations, from what I understand, I'm hedging the hell out of this because I know I'm going to get in trouble, tend to be much more in a relationship with the land as opposed to owning the land, in the broadest of strokes.
Yeah. Well, they're Mother Nature, right? Like it's a greater whole, and you know we're trying to exactly monetize everything. I think we would do better as a country if we listened to the Indigenous elders that have been here
I totally
and know
agree.
the knowledge.
I totally agree. Thank you so much for weighing in with that. Is there anything else that you
Yeah.
wanted to throw into the mix, or?
No, that was all. I'm here as an ally to any Indigenous folks that want to, you know, proceed in the government, because I really truly feel that we're not going to get where we need to unless we bring Indigenous folks abroad. Like it has to be much bigger than it is now.
Perfect. Couldn't agree more. Thank you so much for weighing in. Politics of, it's such a long name and it doesn't show up on my thing, so I have to try
disability and equity.
Thank you for being patient with me. What's going on tonight?
Well, I was just listening to Pinky there, or Packet Princess. That's what it was, Packet Princess. Sorry. And I, first of all, I'm whitey too, but I have a lot of Indigenous cousins. You know, one half of my family's Irish, and they all married Indigenous. And so, but what I want to say, like just interacting, I've been around Indigenous people most of my life, and when I talk to people now, though, when I talk to them, Indigenous folks that maybe I don't know that well, and I talk to them about politics and getting involved in our political system, and I know it's not just me. I know that there's a sense, a lot of them don't feel like, first of all, there's the thing where they've been fighting for their own internal governments and to govern themselves. There's that, but there's also this just they don't feel there's a value in them getting involved. Not all of them, because we have some wonderful Indigenous politicians in Canada, and I don't want to say I know Indigenous people that are in politics, but I'm saying it's hard to get. I know that there's still a struggle getting more Indigenous candidates, and it's because of an apprehension and not seeing a value. They don't see themselves in our government, so they don't see a value in seeing themselves in the government of Canada. And many still feel like, well, the government of Canada, that's one nation, and then we're another nation.
Yep.
And so, but I feel it too, like if they were more involved, and if we could show them that there's value in having them making decisions within Canadian governments, I think that there would be a huge value to them and us for doing it. And I just want to say that.
Yeah, no, I don't disagree with you. I think that there's a really complex inherent challenge to that. And I think a big part of it stems out of the fact that when we talk about systems of governance, and I'm going to please, if there's anybody who's Indigenous or First Nations who's listening to this and I screw this up, throw rocks at me all day long because I have no illusions. It's a middle-aged white guy talking on the mic right now. But I think part of the big challenge that we have in that conversation is the fact that when we're talking about systems of governance, and we see this playing out, particularly in BC, in real time with the whole
That's where I'm
Wet'suwet'en
from.
situation, because you talk about hereditary chiefs and you talk about the hereditary governance structures and the hereditary leadership and all of the things that existed before we came and screwed it all up for them. And then we showed up and we said, hey, we've got this thing called the Indian Act. You'll like it or we'll kill you. And
well, we imposed the elected chief system on them.
Yes.
And so there's, you're right. Like it's this colonialist aspect where they're like, well, we kind of reject these colonialist systems.
Yes.
And I'm saying there are some that do see a value in becoming engaged, but there are still a lot that are just like, you know what, like we have our hereditary. I mean, that's the whole thing with Wet'suwet'en, as you said, is, you know, a lot of people are rejecting, you know, they're on the side of the hereditary chiefs and rejecting the Indian Act imposed system of chiefs, of elected chiefs, and say no, like this is, and it's complex, but it's even more complex when you're getting into like, how do they see themselves if, you know, they're already having that fight and they're rejecting that, and then they want to come, but we're like, well, no, come a part of this. And it's like, it's almost like, I think to some it might almost seem like a form of an extended form of assimilation.
Yes, absolutely. I've heard that. Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that it's, you know, especially in BC, it's even more complicated because you add to the equation the fact that in BC, because of the way that that province happened, there are huge parts of BC that aren't part of Canada. And that's a really hard thing for people to hear and to kind of wrap their heads around a little bit. But the reality is, this is the whole idea of unceded territories. There are huge parts of BC that are not covered by treaties. And the United Nations has been very, very clear.
Almost none of it is.
Yeah. They've been very, very clear that this is not, it's not Canada. And as much as, you know, we have this people who have grown up without the awareness of all of these historical complexities, as much as we've grown up with this whole piece of, well, of course it's Canada, it's right there on the map. The reality is that it's simply not the case. And this is why I say it is so complex and it is so.
Well, there's places in BC too, to be clear, like, you know, you go up to Bella Coola and play, like there's places in BC where it really is like a different country.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like it's, I mean, parts of Alberta too, don't get me wrong. Like I've been all over this province but definitely like that was one of the things that I thought was so great. Like it's complex. It's good and it's bad, but it does give them a solid ground. Like they were able to push back on Danielle Smith because almost the entire province is covered in treaty.
Yes. Well, it's the same thing with the separatists.
And that gives them some protection from, you know, sovereignty acts and.
Yeah. Well,
but proxy helps us out a little bit too.
I've always found great irony in the fact. I want to say thanks for tapping in, but I've always found great irony in the fact that, well, the last couple of years, anyways, I haven't always been as informed as I am now. But when you have all of these separatists who are like, we're going to take Alberta and join Montana or whatever, and the reality is, y'all can't. Because every square inch of Alberta is treaty land that's negotiated with the Crown. So you can have all your little referendums, you can have all your little rallies, and you can enjoy your Facebook page and everything like that. But unless you can get, and this is the fundamental truth, unless you can get every single Indigenous person, every single First Nations person to vote to disregard their existing treaties, some of which, let's be clear, really suck, and sign up with the white dudes the second time around, it's never, ever going to happen. That's the ballgame.
No, you're right. And well, it's so funny because I wasn't going to come on tonight, but now that we're in this conversation, there was something I was thinking of making a blurb about because it kind of irritated me. I'm watching this weekend, and I see this, those Canadian Heritage ads. And there's this Canadian heritage ad, and it's about the Acadians, well, which were French. They were basically serfs. They rejected the French crown, blah, blah, blah. But a lot of them had settled here ahead of the British winning the war with the French crown. And but the terms of the heritage ad was that, and the British took us off our homeland. It was like in like Newfoundland or something. Just like, it wasn't your homeland though. There was some other people that were here before you. It's actually their homeland, and you came from another place, even though you didn't like it very much and they didn't treat you very good. Like, we don't all get to have a homeland that's been nice to us.
Totally agree.
Yeah.
Politics, I want to thank you so much. I gotta line up.
I gotta go too.
This is unprecedented, and I gotta put a hard cap in like 18 minutes because this is going for 2.5 hours. This is turning into a Lord of the Rings episode, and I don't think anybody wants that. But I want to bring Brent into the room. Brent, it appears you might be a lawyer.
Well, only by day.
Is that something that you get to turn off?
Yeah, you know what? I really do, and I insist that I do. But lately I've become crazy, and I'm the candidate for the Alberta Party for Edmonton to court. And I'm listening to the podcast, and I have taken several cultural competency seminars and the like, and the depth of understanding that you need to converse with elders of First Nations is astounding. And I don't know that I'll ever get there. But the bottom line is they don't trust us. And that's the
with
way
good
it
reason.
is.
Let's be clear, with really good reason.
Yeah, no doubt about it. But I did want to bring your listeners' attention to Patrick Stewart, who's the Alberta Party candidate in Castle Downs. Patrick Stewart is Métis, and he has directed his lineage directly back to Louis Riel. And so if you would like to, engage with a First I'm sorry,
Métis.
My language. Yes, he's Métis, but he's Indigenous. Yes, he's one of the 3 recognized Indigenous groups. Contact Patrick and talk to him. Contact me. The Alberta Party is quite committed to robust Indigenous relations, and it's a tough road. Anybody who's tried to go down it knows that it's a tough road. Good to have these conversations. Good to have the citizens out there trying to talk about ways to get Indigenous people engaged in our politics. Well, our politics are not their history, and that's the hardest part.
That's a solid point, man. You know what? I've already made the Captain Picard joke, because I think that it's awesome that the Alberta Party is running somebody with the same name as the actor who plays Captain Picard. So I gotta see if I can track down, if you can DM me his DM the breakdown his email address. I will commit right now that we will send him an invite to come say hi.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. I will do that.
Awesome. Thanks, man. I think that's it. I think that's where we're gonna draw the line in the sand tonight, because there's some fascinating folks that are trying to add in, and I'm not convinced of the honesty of their intentions, I'll say. But I do want to say, wow, what a conversation today. I was planning on the show going for like an hour and then maybe half an hour of speakers, and y'all crushed it tonight. Thank you so much for all the different perspectives. Thank you so much for listening and choosing to spend your time with this conversation. It means the world if you're listening to the podcast version. Thank you so much for sticking out for 2 hours and 20 minutes. And Frodo gets the ring at the end. I'll just at the end of this episode, that's what's going to happen. Actually, that's not true. I have a little treat that I've been saving up for the end of the episode, and it's coming a little bit later. But one of the things that we talk about on the show all the time is the fact that there are pundits, there are hacks, there are opinionators. I just made that word up. Who well, there's a lot of people who like to talk about politics. There's a lot of people who like to be involved in politics. But then there is this other class of people, and they're called journalists. And they are the great protection that we have in place to keep our democracy going, because it's been said many times before, the foundation of any functioning democracy, functioning society is a well-informed electorate. And what that requires is journalists who are telling stories in such a way that they are not manipulating people. They're not deliberately trying to bring people around to a point. They're simply telling the stories with an honesty that is absolutely required. They're not serving a political agenda. That's absolutely required. And we're not that. We're at this show, we do punditry, we do commentary, we make jokes, we play with puppets. We are absolutely not journalists. We do not want anyone to mistake us for being journalists, because nobody who's doing any of those things should be pretending to be a journalist. And yet, we have a lot of folks who are. We have a lot of folks who have figured out that if you make people scared, if you make people afraid, you can make a boatload of money off of them. We have a lot of folks who will lie, straight up lie to people, because that's what's going to get them the clicks. That's what's going to get them the subscriptions. And it's gross, quite frankly. And it is a poison in our society that there are these people who have figured out how to weaponize the amazing thing that the internet is, to try to create all of these garbage narratives that exist. Anyways, I don't know what made me think of that right before I play this clip, but I'm going to let this clip play us out because I think it's awesome. And just again, thank you to everybody. I'm going to do the line now because we're just going to shut it down as soon as the clip's done. Thank you to everybody for participating tonight. Thank you to all of our Patreon sponsors. Thank you. Just thanks, everybody. Take care of yourselves. We'll see you. We got Wednesday. We got us a show. Steve Boots on the Ground, who does some of the best political commentary, satire stuff that is on the TikTok machine. I'm terrible at TikTok. He's going to give us a lesson on that. He's going to talk about advocacy. He's going to talk about what it takes to sustain advocacy and activism. It's a really great conversation. We had a lot of fun. We're going to be dropping that on Wednesday for all of our public listeners. It'll go up tomorrow for our Patreon supporters. Last plug for the Patreon page, www.patreon.com/thebreakdownab. Thank you so much, everybody. Take care of yourselves and keep the conversation going.
Question for Mayor Gondek, Kean with the counter signal. Just a few months ago, a handful of months ago, you were fighting tooth and nail against increasing the police budget, and you were actively supporting defund the police rhetoric. I'm just wondering, when you realized that police forces were not optional, did it take the random stabbings, wives getting stabbed, police officers getting killed, to realize that it was important to fund police departments? And how can Calgarians trust you when you flip-flop on basic issues like public safety?